All right, everybody, welcome back to the Money Made Simple podcast with Oakwood Wealth Partners. My name is Nick Lockwood. I'm one of the financial planners here. Today's Wednesday. So, Dad, how's your Wednesday morning going?
It's going well, Nick. Thanks for asking.
I saw somebody ordered some cinnamon rolls into the office this morning, so I know that you've been well fed so far today.
I just had one. So again, we do this, Nick, and you tease me, but we do these. We order these little gifts just to see what we want to send to our clients. If it's good, we send it out to our clients. If it's not good, we move on. So
In full disclosure, I had one yesterday.
I know you did, because when I came in the office, there was only like 3 left.
Yeah. So, anyways, well, hey guys, we're excited today. We've got a guest, so that's Celeste Gurule, and I'll introduce her here just in a second. But the topic of the episode today, we spend a lot of time planning for financial futures, so looking at income streams and investments and estate planning and all the things that go into the financial plan. But what often gets overlooked is some of the non-financial components that we need to keep in mind as we age. So things like, as we get older, where do we want to live, or what's our social environment going to look like? What's our interaction going to look like as we get older and we're maybe not going to work? So Celeste, I'll introduce you here. I know you and my dad go way back, and so because of that, you and I also go way back. But let me read your bio here just to get you introduced, and then we can keep things moving. So Celeste Gurule graduated from the University of California at Berkeley. So I was thinking about this. That means Celeste has more brain cells, Dad, than you and I probably combined with that alma mater. So anyways, in 1987, with a Bachelor of Arts degree in political economics. The same year, Celeste joined California Fringe Benefit, which was an affiliate of Lincoln Financial Advisors, as an advisor in the healthcare 403B marketplace. In 1991, she earned her CFP certification. She began transitioning from advising to leadership in 1994, where she was appointed the Executive Vice President of Client Relations and Development for California Fringe Benefit, and then the President of CFB on January 1st of 2000. So we had to make sure that the world didn't implode with Y2K rolling over before Celeste could start that next chapter of her career. But then in April of 2006, she took on a national role with Lincoln Financial Group, where she became the managing director of Financial Professionals Group. In this role, she led approximately 200 advisors who served the employer-sponsored retirement plan marketplace. After 34 years, Celeste retired from Lincoln in 2021 and started consulting to continue to help advisors and their organizations grow. I'll skip a little bit here, but wanted to point out that now Celeste works in a consultant role for kind of our affiliated advisor group, which is called Momentum Value Partners. Celeste and her husband Jim live in Danville, California, have 2 grown children, Anthony, who's married to Dina, and Julia, and of course, 1 new baby granddaughter, Maya. So Celeste, with that read, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and maybe add in anything that I missed?
Well, I don't think I'm going to add in anything. That was already a mouthful. But I'm really pleased to be here. And it's great to come on with both of you, who, as you said, we've had a long-standing relationship. And it's fun to be able to collaborate and talk about these things that are so important. So thanks for
Yeah.
having me.
Yeah, let me say real quick, Celeste and I have been buddies. We were hired together, probably 3 months within each other. So we've grown up together. We got married while we were we were single when we met. And now we're married. We have kids and grandkids. But Celeste is she's a mentor to all, including me. She's one of the my wife. She probably is one of the most respected women for my wife because of all that she's done as a mom and as a leader. So Celeste, I don't know about Nick, but I'm really happy to have you here joining us here today. So, and to what she's going to talk about today, her and I have experienced in our own lives with our own parents. And we've also talked to colleagues and friends. They're going through the same challenges with their parents. And so Celeste, through her consulting, has been working on this platform that she wants to share with us today about how to take those next steps beyond that financial planning step that you take with your parents. So Celeste.
Yeah, Celeste, what I was going to say is I know when you were working full time, so not just kind of in the consultant role that you're in now, most of your day was spent really in the business with the operations and the mechanics behind how do we get these organizations to grow and these advisors to be successful and to ultimately be better teams for our clients. Now, though, as I've gotten to see over the past few years since you've kind of retired in quotes and you're still doing some sort of consultant work, you've been able to put a lot of thought into maybe some of these projects that you're more passionate about because you have that time to do that. So I'm excited to talk today through the future living plan. So why don't we, Celeste, maybe from your words, why don't you describe what the future living plan is? Let's start there.
Okay, great. Well, really, what it is it's a roadmap. And it's a roadmap of what life looks like, or really better, what you want it to look like when you start experiencing changes in your capabilities, whether that be physically or cognitively. And I'm not just talking about the big things, right? I'm not just talking about you have a stroke or you have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. I'm talking about a lot more likely scenarios. And some of those things might be, you know, you can't physically handle your household anymore. Whether it's the big yard, or maybe it's deferred maintenance, or maybe it's, your spouse dies and now you're in it on your by yourself and your kids don't live in the area. Or maybe it's I can't drive any longer. And so what does that mean to me? And then finally, I want to talk about the financial capacity, because it's something that people just don't think about very often, and they don't think it's going to happen to them. But I was really kind of stunned by a statistic that I read. That Do you guys know what our where we peak in terms of our ability to make good financial decisions? Any idea what the age is?
I'm gonna say 63 because Dad, I think you're
No,
probably about 63.
I'm gonna say 45. You just said that just to compliment me, Nick. I think it's like 45, Celeste, right?
Okay, well, we'll come right in the middle. It's 53. I
Hmm.
was really surprised by that. And this is just normal cognitive decline as we get older. And we don't, share that to scare people, but it's just the reality that, that's our peak. And so it's really important that people think about, well, what happens when I need to have some help, right? With coordinating my financials or even paying my bills. And so that's another piece of it that, you just have to talk about when you start to experience changes in your physical and cognitive abilities. So that's what a future life plan is. What do you want that life to look like?
Yeah, and I can't remember if I mentioned this while we've been recording or if this was before we started the actual recording, but to me it's I think I did mention this, but the whole point of the future living plan is to be super intentional with all aspects of our lives. So financial, like you mentioned, but then, also those social factors and things like that too. So Celeste, why this project? I mean, I know you always have tons of ideas. Why is this
Yeah.
something that has been important to you to put together in a format that people can follow and implement?
Yeah. And before I answer that question, I just want to reinforce what you just said, Nick. I mean, the key is to be proactive about these things and think about them early, right? Because the earlier you can start talking about it, the better decisions you can make, because you just have more time to be thoughtful about it. So to answer your question about why did I become passionate about this, or why did I get involved? And it really started back with I've been involved in the financial planning industry for my whole life, but it really has to do with some personal experiences I had in my family. So, at the age of 27, I lost my mom unexpectedly. She had a heart attack and died at the age of 50. And at the time, I didn't really think about it too much, but she was in the process of putting together her estate plan in terms of her will and trust, but it just didn't get done because we just didn't think, she was going to pass away at age 50. So that obviously is the financial, side of it and legal side of it. But then fast forward 30 years, and then I'm dealing with my dad's second wife, who was diagnosed with cancer, and we did a 3-year battle with her with cancer and trying to determine, what are the options for her in terms of healthcare, but also what needs did we have at home for her care. And at the same time, my dad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And so, we were dealing with that at the same time. And, if I'm being completely honest, I was sticking my head in the sand about dad. We were dealing with Susan's issues. And I didn't really want to think about dad. And I remember she finally took me for a walk. We were at the farmer's market and she said, "We really need to talk about your dad. I'm not sure if I'm going to be around much longer. And, you need to come to terms with what's going on with your dad." And so it was all those experiences that really made me take a look at this and get very passionate about it. And then a more recent experience was a good friend whose husband had a accident when he was in his 40s and had a brain injury. And now he's 63 and his cognitive decline has been significant. And she just recently had to put him into a memory home. And so I was trying to help her with, okay, she was so overwhelmed, but what questions we should be asking when we go visit these places, and how do you pay for it, and what are, how does Medicare work, and how does Medi-Cal work, and all of those things. So that was really all of these personal experiences, and then working in the field that brought all of this to my attention, if you will, or where I want to spend some time and energy.
Yeah. You guys, I'm just thinking here. I think I want to skip over a section that we were going to talk about, and I think it might be helpful if we just go through with the future living plan. What are those 7 areas that people should be thinking about? And we don't need to spend a ton of time in each of those sections, but just so that our audience gets a sense of what are we talking about when it comes to the living plan, what needs to be addressed. And then we can move to maybe some of the other sections that we had planned on discussing. So let me read these 7 sections out. So for our listeners, again, this is the 7 areas that you want to address for yourself as you get older, or maybe it's a conversation that you have with your parents, just to kind of think about and be intentional about those things that maybe aren't your financial planning and your investment accounts. So the first section is the purpose and the identity. Second is community and social connection. Third is housing and living environment. Fourth is health and wellness. Fifth is legal. Sixth is financial. And the seventh is family communications and roles. So those are the 7 areas that we'll go through some of those here. But Celeste, why don't you, as you're building out those 7 different areas to plan for with this plan, maybe how did you think about putting those together, and what are a couple that you think are really important that, maybe give us an example of how we think about something like community and social connection.
Hmm. Yeah, I think, as we start to get older, we do think about things like maybe, what happens if my health fails, or what happens if I need help, and these kinds of things. But we don't tend to think about, well, what happens, like, um in terms of, let's take an example of, I can't drive any longer. So I'll give you a story about my dad. So when he received his diagnosis of Alzheimer's, the healthcare facility had to let the DMV know about that diagnosis. And so then they said, well, Mr. Cowell, unfortunately, you can no longer drive. And so I had to tell him that he could no longer drive. And so that was traumatic in itself, to, with what we had to deal with. But then it was thinking through, well, how does he stay connected in his community, and how does he continue to do the different things that he was doing from a volunteer standpoint, because he volunteered for the police department and in his church. And so we had to really look at what all those other options were. And I didn't know what those things were before. And it was just one day he could drive and one day he couldn't. And so then it was like quickly trying to figure that out. And so, I found out that there are community organizations that will actually come pick him up. But I also found that he had a very strong group at the church. And so they were taking turns to come pick him up and bring him to these various things. And his partner at the police department was willing to pick him up to continue, so that he could continue to do his volunteer, patrolling. I also learned that trying to get him to order an Uber ride was about impossible. He really couldn't do that on the phone, and it was just too complicated. And that might be another job. I want to try to figure out how to have a Uber app for older individuals. But anyway, so those are the kinds of things that you want to think through in advance, so that when that time comes, it's not having to do it in the spur of the moment.
Celeste, I think part of, and we've got two, I think, two areas we're talking about. We're talking about me as a 85, 90-year-old making the decision, and me as a 60-year-old talking to my parents about it. But as we get older, Celeste, you know this, our mind thinks we can do certain things that our body just can't keep up with. And I believe as we get older, that doesn't change. And so, to your dad's point, he probably still thinks he can do all this stuff. And so, when you're asking him, "Hey, we should do this, we should do that," it's almost offensive, right? I think that's where the discussions, if we have them earlier, so that the expectations are there, then it's a little bit easier. But if we're waiting till the last minute, or if we're it's you know real quickly, my story, I've got a 92-year-old father-in-law, and good fella, and he's actually in great shape. His mind's working, but he's in a big house, and he thinks he can still clean the pool, and he thinks he can still trim the hedges and the trees and things like that. But he's tripping and he's falling and things like that. But he won't leave that house. That's his home. So we you can't budge, because I can handle it. And I think that's the hard part for a lot of folks as they're getting up there a little bit older. So me personally, I hit 80, I'm going to a nice community, old folks center. But some people they still have that independence. Like, and I know your dad. I know your dad has that independence, and that's a big challenge. So yeah.
Yeah, well, you know Dad well, right? He helped
Yeah.
bring you into the business,
Your
but
dad hired
and
me.
it's true. I know, and it's really interesting because you do know Dad very well, and I tell him, Dad, have you ever thought about going into one of these senior living homes? And he's like, Oh, no, no, I'm not doing that. And he tells me why, and I said, Dad, you would be the mayor in about 5 minutes.
That's
You'd
right.
have everybody in the lunchroom. You'd be having coffee, with everybody, and you'd be the mayor. Oh, no, 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 and so it
Yeah.
is hard. It's
Yeah.
really hard to have those discussions and change, or loss of control, or autonomy, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
So
But it's
Celeste,
important. And now I wish, Mike, that I had had more of those conversations when he was really able to, where we
Mm-hmm.
could have had a logical conversation about it and talked about the pros and the cons. And um, so those are some of the things, Nick, that I think are really important when it comes to that community and social connection. And
yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to ask. If you could go back 10 years, right? And let's
Mhm.
say this was all being formulated, this plan was being formulated back at that point. I mean, what would you have done differently, or what questions would you have asked as it relates to that social, environmental, component of this plan? What would have asked your dad so that it would have made your life easier when this ultimately happened?
Yeah, and Nick, that's a great question. And that's why I came up with the future living plan. It is a framework for a discussion so that you can have these kinds of conversations with either your spouse or even with your parents, right? And I would have just asked, okay, knowing how important, for example, doing your volunteer work is, if you weren't able to do that one day because you weren't able to drive, then is that still important to you? How would you like to approach it? Because, before that they've really started to experience these changes, it's just a hypothetical conversation, and it's a lot easier to have, right?
Yeah,
Um,
I'm just thinking for myself,
mhm.
I'm a bit a ways from, this stage of my life, but I personally love to play golf as much as I can. And so I've got my group of buddies that I'll go play with. And so, even if it's something as shallow as a biweekly round of golf with certain friends, it's like, is that important to you? How can we build on those relationships as you get older, even if maybe you aren't able to go out and play golf anymore? So I'm just trying to, put myself in those shoes and figure out for me, if my physical ability started to decline, what is it out of that golf round that I really appreciate that I want to make sure that I can bring with me, maybe if it's not, on the golf course anymore. Okay, another big one too is purpose and identity. So I think people, from what I can tell, we always have maybe identity crisis as we go through different phases of life. But one that we often see is when we retire, right? We go from working every day, and that is a big part of our identity, to I'm not working anymore, so who am I? another kind of natural identity crisis time is likely when we're starting to lose some of these either cognitive or physical abilities as we age. So Celeste, maybe if you know, just using your dad as an example, in his case, what sorts of questions, if you could go back 10 years ago, would you have been asking your dad to make sure that you had a good understanding of what was important to him about his identity and how you could help kind of cultivate that as he got older?
Yeah, if I think about questions, it would just be really understanding what was important to him and what he would want to continue to do, and maybe in a little bit of a different light, right? So dad was very involved, for example, with doing all of the volunteer work at the church, and some of it he just couldn't physically do anymore. But to your point, if it was the handling all of the funerals wasn't the most important part, it was communicating with the families. Well, and that could be a piece that he could still do, even though maybe he couldn't physically take all of the hard work that goes into putting on a funeral. So I think I would have asked those kinds of questions. What's most important to you here? What do we make sure that we keep you engaged in, and how do we do that? Um, and yeah, I think those are the kinds of questions that I would ask him. And I think that you have to also help to remind them that there is still a lot of purpose that they can have in their lives, even if some of the things have to change.
Right, right. Okay, another section here, family and communication roles. So, can
Mhm.
you maybe describe that a little bit and how we should be thinking about family and communication roles as it relates to this plan?
Right. So I think, as we've talked about, it's just really important to put this roadmap together. And I think it's important for whether it's an individual or couple, what do they want life to look like? What are their desires? What are their goals? And then once they put that together in a plan about how they feel about things, I think it's really important to communicate that to their family, whether it's their children or other loved ones that might be involved in helping them as they start to experience these changes. And I think it's important from a couple of different standpoints. One, you want to communicate your wishes and desires, because a lot of times kids, they just feel like, oh, if I don't know what mom and dad want, and then we have to make these decisions, especially if it's in a crisis time, they might feel really badly about, well, am I doing the right thing? But if mom and dad have communicated that, then they know, okay, you know what? This is what they wanted. We can go ahead and move forward, and we're going to feel really good about it. I think that the roles part is also a really important thing to talk about. So, for example, just with my brother and I live locally. So I do all of the, weekly day to day stuff, weekly stuff with dad. But my brother, he knows that his role is, if I'm out of town and he needs to come, down, he's going to do that because he lives about hour and a half away. But he also knows that anything to do with the house in terms of maintenance, that's his role, and that's his if you will, his strength. So he'll come down and take care of that, whether that's rebuilding dad's fence or we're putting cameras in, to help with dad. So I think that, communications with the family so they know what your desires and wishes are, and then also roles for the family to play. Caregiving can be a very difficult thing. And so also talking about when that becomes needed, talking about roles and just the caregiving of a parent. Especially if it's going to fall, on the shoulders of maybe one more than another. So those things are important. In fact, we were talking about this earlier. That I saw this post that I thought was just fascinating, where a fellow was saying that when the last parent dies, the likelihood of the siblings remaining a strong unit has a lot to do with if they had these conversations prior to these things happening, right? Because if those things were discussed and everybody was able to get their feelings out, that doesn't mean they're not going to be without difficulties and there's not going to be some bumps in the road. But at least those things are discussed ahead of time, and so that when that last parent does pass away, the siblings have a much better chance of keeping that strong central family unit, as opposed to maybe it was just mom or dad keeping that together. So those important
Celeste, we
conversations.
we have one of the things when we talk to our clients, when they get to their 70s and 80s, we really push them to have family financial planning meetings where the kids are coming in and we're talking about the assets. Okay, mom passes, dad passes. Here's where things are going, and we don't always get into the numbers. We just talk about the logistics of how it's going to work. And when those conversations are happening, it's a natural it's a natural evolution to start talking about the other pieces that you're pointing out here. But if parents aren't comfortable sharing what they have, I don't think kids are quite comfortable talking to them about the next steps of their lives. I think it's, you know what I'm saying? I think it has to all kind of go together, and there has to be, to your point, a healthy family communication dynamics. I mean, I've got two examples of clients, and they're on the opposite end of the spectrum. One, two girls. One mainly was the caregiver. The other one was resentful for all the time being spent with mom, and the two girls fight. Right? Mom passed. The two girls fight. I've got another couple, and this couple. They spoke at one of our conferences. Um, I have two girls. He now has dementia, Alzheimer's, and she's dealing with it. But both girls are involved. They know exactly the plan for dad, what we're going to do. If something happens to mom, what's the plan for mom? They know the finances. They're actually taking care of everything for them right now. So two different examples. One where there was no open communication about finances and money, and there was resentment, and the other one where everything is out in the open, and there's a plan for dad, there's a plan for mom. The girls know they're going to be okay. They're not financially well off, but I really don't get the impression they care about the money. They care about mom and dad, and that to me is just so, that's so, heartening, where you're like, yeah, that's the way it should be. So we see, Celeste, you were in this business too. You see so many situations where folks are passing away, and the siblings just start bickering, because they didn't have that common plan with mom and dad. So
I think
yeah.
like so many challenges that we go through in life, communication goes a long way in alleviating some of those issues. But the thing is, we have to communicate. So whether that's a disagreement with a coworker or a spouse, or planning big picture for where the kids are going to go to college, or whatever it may be, just communicating and sharing ideas, I think can often help get us over those challenges that we face. But the truth is, not everybody has those conversations. So in the context of this conversation, most people presumably have not thought this through all the way. Maybe they've thought a lot about their financial planning and the money, but like what we're talking about here with Celeste, they haven't done all the work to have those conversations. So what do you guys think gets in the way of making this, what makes this so hard to talk about, I guess? Like what do you think gets in people's way?
Well, I think like we were talking about earlier for the parent, I know I've experienced this with my own, is that, these are just, you start to think I'm losing my autonomy. There's a fear of losing control, right? I don't really want my kids to be that involved in my life. I think there's also, it signals mortality. And so now I have to start thinking about that. And who wants to think about that? Nobody does. And I think there's also a shame and pride. I mean, I see that a lot, where, you don't want to admit that you need help. My dad will constantly say, no, 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 I can do that. I can do that. Oh, I know, dad. I know you can. And it's, having a conversation about why we need to start doing these things in advance. And having these conversations so that we don't have to deal with an issue when it does take place. So I think that it's just they're really hard conversations, and you don't think you need the help, but I think those are the things that get in the way from a parent. And then from a child, I know that a lot of it is that role reversal, right? And that's really uncomfortable. Your parents were the people that you looked up to, they were the rock, they were there for you for
Celeste,
everything,
it's
and now
probably
that's
hard, like
reversing.
the role reversal on both sides too,
Yeah.
right? It's for the parent to now be being cared for, and for the
Yes.
child to be the one now caring for the parent. So yeah, I just wanted to, I was
Yeah.
thinking that. So just want to add
No,
that
you're
in there.
right. Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
sure you have things to add, Mike, to that.
Yeah, and again, from talking to your parents, I think it's, you don't you don't want to feel like like as I said before, you don't want to feel like you care about the money, you know, and you're afraid that they're going to think, oh, he just wants to know how much money I have. You know, when I helped my in-laws, when mom was still alive, we helped them go through a trust, and I was very blunt with them, and I didn't care. We were trying to get it done right, correctly, right? We couldn't beat around the bush on stuff. So I asked her, I said, "What do you have? What do we got to do?" And they were, to their credit, they were totally open with me. But I think some children aren't. They don't they don't feel comfortable asking mom and dad what they have planned already, you know, because that's just, again, you're talking about dad dying, you're talking about mom dying, and you as as your child don't want to think about that, you know. So
I think, like we were talking about in our last episode, I think it was, having, maybe it was a couple meetings ago, I can't, or a couple podcasts ago, I can't remember, but we were talking about one in the dynamic between spouses. If there's a spouse who doesn't care to know about the finances of the household, the spouse who does take the finances, they need to speak up, and they need to make sure that the other spouse has at least heard a couple times what money they have and where income's coming from, right? So I think the same thing is true here. Somebody, whether it's the parent or the child, at some point needs to be the one to speak up and say, hey, let's just at least start this conversation so that we're on the same page. Because like you said, Celeste, as soon as a crisis happens, there's no more planning that can be done. And people find themselves oftentimes, without having done the planning, in some really challenging scenarios that could have been totally avoided just by having some type of conversation. You mentioned trust, Dad. I'm thinking about myself here, like, as reasons why, what would prevent me from having this type of conversation down the road. I think for me, it's just as simple as you just don't think to do it because you're so busy doing what you're already doing. And so a specific example of this is, I tell people all day long that they need to have their estate documents done, right? But me and Sarah just got ours done last week, and we only got ours done because we were going out of town for the first time without our toddler, and we wanted to make sure that there was guardianship set up for her. And so, if anything, it was Sarah's, right, her action that got me to go through the process of getting all the documents put together and all that. So, you know, I knew that it was important. It's just we just never did it. So the
life
fact
gets in
is,
the way. Yeah.
yeah, she in that case, she was the one who said, we're going to get this done, we need to do it before we go out of town. And now it's done. Everything's been notarized, it's been signed. If something happens to us, at least at a minimum, we know that some planning has been done. And so, yeah, the money will go to Charlotte, but then also guardianships in there, and all the other estate documents. So yeah, the whole takeaway is just start the conversation somewhere.
Mom and I didn't get our trust done until we went away the first time to leave you alone.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's like, we could have done it earlier, but we just didn't do it until it was an emergency. So this kind of conversation, do we have it now, or do we wait till it's an emergency, right? And we'd have no other choice. So.
Right. And in our case, we came back safe and sound from our trip to Santa Barbara, so all is good there. But had something happened, right, we had our plan done, and all that would have been taken care of.
And I know I've been talking a lot about, my own situation with my father, but, the thing that I think about, and my husband and I were just having this conversation, that we need to start having this conversation and going through these questions that are, part of this framework for discussion, because there isn't a good time to do it. And it, it gives you the time to really thoughtfully think through all of these things. And it doesn't mean that if we come up with answers today, that might not change, 60s versus 70s versus 80s. And that's the whole purpose of this future living plan. It's supposed to evolve as you evolve. But, to your point, let's start these conversations early. And I think as parents, we need to take the initiative and start those conversations for the sake of, putting our desires and wishes in place so that we can share that with our children. I don't know. I just think it's our responsibility to do that, to make it a little bit easier, because it is what we want our life to look like, right? As we experience change.
Sure. Yeah. And just going through this, I know that this is something that we'll take to our clients to make sure that we're at least prompting them to have these. We don't necessarily need to be a part of the conversation, but just giving them the tools and the resources that they need internally to be able to have some of these conversations together. So I'm excited to do that. I think a couple takeaways here that I've written down is, start earlier than you think you need to with having these conversations. Like we always say, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So it doesn't need to be the perfect plan for everything that's going to happen in all contingencies, but you need to start somewhere so that at least, everyone agrees upon a few wishes and desires. Celeste, can you talk a little bit about what resources you guys have put
To
together?
that point, Nick, right? And 80%, we have this thing that we always talk about, 80% done is better than 0% done. And then that next 20%, you get 80% done of that. So you just have to get started. And a lot of time it seems overwhelming. But if Celeste gives you a checklist of 10 things to do and you get 2 done, that was 2 more than you had to start with. And so it doesn't need to be perfect, to your point, Nick.
Right. Celeste, can you talk a little bit about the resources that you guys have put together? Because I know you've put a lot of work into that.
Sure. So the first thing is that discussion framework. So it has those 7 areas that we talked about, and there is a number of questions under each area for you to think through. And if you look at the document, it's overwhelming, right? You got how many questions under each area. And so we
Yeah.
also put in a column that you could mark what are your priorities. So to your point, Mike, just start with a couple of things, start that conversation, jot some ideas down. And then maybe you come back, a month later and you tackle a few more things, or it could even be a year later. But we do have that discussion, so it'll give you the most important questions to ask yourselves about, how you feel about those things. We also have a resource guide. So let's say, for example, that you are interested in looking at maybe a senior living arrangement versus aging in your home. Well, we've got some resources there that you can look up. What do those look like? What kind of benefits do they offer? But let's say you decide that you do want to stay in your home and grow older in your home. Well, then, we have resources about things that you might need to do in terms of your home to make it safe. So that's the resource guide. We also have a life inventory document. So this document allows you to put absolutely everything down in one place of all the different things that are related to your life. So funny story, Dad had a tree die. Well, I didn't know who his landscape person was, and so I had to just go there on a Thursday because I knew they came at 10 and just wait so I could talk to him because I didn't know how to get a hold of them. So, I mean, it's even funny things like that, right? I mean, we always think about account numbers and passwords, but it's even things like, the landscape or the handyman when the, toilet decides to not work. So that's the life inventory document, and then the resource document, and then the discussion framework. So
Celeste,
those are the 3
I'm
things.
I'm just thinking about that. So even that life inventory checklist, that might be the perfect segue into opening up that conversation. So if you are the child of a parent who is in their maybe 80s or 90s, right, and you're hearing this thinking maybe I should have these conversations, maybe just grab that checklist, take that over to mom and dad's house and say, hey, who's your gardener?
Yeah.
Who's the electrician? And just start to compile some of those numbers.
Those are
Mhm.
easy answers. Those are easy questions to answer from a parent standpoint, right? So you can
Right.
start with something silly, and I know it sounds silly, Celeste, but if you start with something like that, it might just kind of keep growing to, okay, now what do you want me to do with your
Right.
your body when you pass, right? And can grow. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And
so
it, it
one way
makes
to.
me think of something else real quick is that, the other thing that we just see more and more are, the amount of scams and
Mm,
fraud that's happening these days. That's another reason to make sure that you are sharing some of these things and getting your kids involved because, it's another set of eyes looking at things or
yeah.
someone to bounce ideas off of. Hey, I got this call about this, or I got this email about that. Right. So,
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good point. I have access to my father-in-law's online banking account. I don't do anything, but I can see in there large withdrawals. And so if I see $500, hey Mike, I see you took $500 out. Do you know what that was for? And his name's Mike is too, if you're wondering. And he'll tell me, but at least and he's okay with that. He knows that I can see that. So
Yeah.
because yeah.
So, Celeste, if someone's listening to this and they want those documents and those guides, where should they go to get those?
well, I can get them over to you and Mike. I think
Uh,
that's probably the best way.
Okay.
And then you can share them.
Okay. Okay. Well, that sounds good. So, I think as a starting point, a couple ideas to take away with is at least start the conversation somewhere. In our eyes, a family meeting is always a really good natural place to have those conversations. So when you're already reviewing the finances, you can start the conversations as a family that are along the lines of that future living plan and some of the non-financial components of our lives as we age. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good is what I wrote down, and then reach out to our group if you'd like a copy of these resources. And we're happy to, help facilitate those conversations or answer questions. And I know Celeste
Yeah,
would.
Nick, let me read something that Celeste had wrote,
Okay.
which I think is. It says the uncomfortable truth on both sides. Both generations are protecting the same thing from opposite directions. Parents want to preserve the story of who they are. Children want to preserve the story of who their parents are. Acknowledging decline, even potential or future decline, threatens both narratives simultaneously. So the conversation asks everyone in the room to grieve something, even if nothing has been lost yet. So parents are trying to preserve who they are. Children want to preserve who their parents are, who they see them as being. And both of them are going to lose something in the end, but we got to have that conversation. So,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Okay, Celeste, in closing here, anything you think we missed? Any important points that you want to bring up, or do you think we did a pretty good job of encapsulating it all? Which of course we can't do, but tried our
Yeah.
best.
Well, I think we did a pretty good job of getting what the issues are and, how to address them and why. And I can't, just reinforce enough of what you said. Just start the conversation. I think people will be surprised at if you can start the conversation, the good that will come, even if it's difficult.
Sure. Yeah, I
Les, tell
know.
us about Maya. Tell us about
Oh,
Yeah,
Maya.
Maya,
how's grandma life?
Yeah.
the best job in the world,
Yeah.
uh, being a
How's
grandparent.
the pay?
The pay is their kisses and hugs. That's the best pay you'll ever get.
Yeah. Yeah.
Better than anything else. Yeah. I know if somebody had told me how good grandparenting was, I would have started there first.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, Celeste, we're excited to have you on, I'm sure, again in the future. So as you guys continue to build upon this, and I know as our team at Oakwood starts to have these conversations with our clients, we'll keep you posted so that you can keep building that out. But we're excited to see where this goes, and I know it's going to have a lot of good impact on families as they navigate that challenge of people just getting older and having to deal with all the things that come along with that. Dad, anything from you before
Yeah.
we
Les,
close up here?
thank you again. I mean, honestly, this conversation could have went 2 hours. There's just so many things to talk about in this world. So that you're working on. I appreciate the work you and Janine are doing here. So
Yeah. All right, everybody. Well, that will conclude our episode here. So thanks for joining us for another episode of Money Made Simple with Oakwood Wealth Partners. We'll see you guys next time.